Okay, this is the 4th of December Node.js modules team meeting. There's a bunch of people at TC39 this week, so we're going to do the best we can without them. Let's see, we've got another member. Oh, there's Jordan. He's managed to take some time off from TC39. So we've got a few items on the agenda today. The first one is ESM, the get package type utility function is not exposed. Geoffrey, did you add this item recently? I don't think I saw it on the original agenda.
I didn't add it. Do we want to talk about the unflagging timeline schedule stuff first? Because that seems to be like timeline sensitive, whereas the other stuff might not be.
Okay, so let's move on to the next set of issues. We've got conditional exports as flags, loader hooks, instrumentation, unflagging, and stabilizing the resolver. Maybe if you think it's sensible to discuss the unflagging considerations, maybe we start off with conditional exports as flags, then discuss the unflagging stuff while we're discussing that. If that makes sense to everyone. Geoffrey, does that sound sensible?
That's fine with me.
Okay. So this was a issue raised by Tobias, and I was able to catch him on Twitter, chat briefly while he was at this conference. And he's actually interested in implementing exports in Webpack, which is really great. He likes it. We discussed variations of the API, and I tried to get as much feedback from him as I could. The issue specifically here that we're discussing is he wanted ways to be able to support, I believe it's custom conditions and composition of conditions. So how would they support conditions in Webpack that are Webpack specific? And how would they allow those conditions to work with the existing conditions we have? Like, what would it mean for Webpack to say, support the require condition alongside other conditions that are maybe Webpack specific, like browser and things like that? So the clarification there was that the current proposal for conditional exports does support object nesting. So you can nest conditions and group them together. So maybe, since it's one of the things on our unflagging timeline, we can discuss these features a bit and make sure we're happy with these semantics and that they're working for us. Geoffrey, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or anyone else?
Nope.
So otherwise, like Jan?
Yeah, can you hear me? All right. To me, it felt like the issue was actually resolved because I think further on, after we kind of clarified the nesting stuff, he was like, cool, I'll implement this. And then I didn't see any real disagreement or issues anymore. And if that's the case, should we potentially even close the issue as clarified and working as intended?
Yeah, I get the impression it was mostly a clarification issue and that it has been clarified. One action item that could be associated with it is if we want to support custom flags in Node.js itself, kind of in line with the issue title. And then also further than that, I just feel like the uncertainty that might, any uncertainty that might be left around conditional exports, I think is very much about ensuring the edge cases of the semantics work out for all of these use cases, for tools, for the different edges of the ecosystem. So as much as possible for us to be having these discussions, ideally, it would have been great if Tobias could have joined us, but he couldn't. I'll also try and continue to chase up feedback from tooling side, but yeah, I think we can mark it as resolved. Are there any thoughts on having a flag for setting custom conditions in Node.js, or any thoughts on the ways that these conditions compose at the moment, or anything like that?
Can you elaborate a bit more on like the use case in Node?
Sure. So the use case for setting custom conditions would be, I think the canonical example of that's probably like a development or production environment. So say you have an application that can run in two modes, development or production, or
Got it.
just a production flag that's going to resolve things differently. It does cross over with functionality you can achieve equally with top level awaits. But it can be nice to have the resolver way to do it as well, to avoid the sort of code passing costs and things like that. So you would have a kind of environment flag where you can set this custom condition, and then that path would resolve in your exports resolver.
So are you envisioning just pivoting on node env, or generically any environment variables, or something different? Because like,
right,
there's a lot typically in the ecosystem, a lot of people use environment variables. Many of them, like Babel env, sit on top of node env and like, you know, interoperate with them. And then there's plenty that are not. And underscore env with production development, but pivot between things. Like, yeah, I mean, I have a number of use cases for environment variables, and many of my use cases for environment variables are actually resolving different things in tests, so that I can, in my CI matrix, I can say, I want this job to run with deep equal, and I want this other job to run with the native assert implementation. And I use an environment variable to do that. And I just require dynamically a different file, but if the resolver could do that for me in my own package, I would use that. But when I'm thinking of like defining different environment variable things for other people to consume, really the only use case I can come up with is like when people do what like React does, and they make like a roll-up bundle for dev and for prod or something, and trying to select.
It's very much that React use case where they have that single index file that has if development require development, if production require production, because that's just a single wrapper module that could just be something in the resolver itself. Corey?
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention the only thing that concerns me about what Jordan just said is if I have a package which, say, uses node_env equals test, it would be unexpected to me for one of my dependencies to react to that. Because ultimately I'm setting that environment usually because I want to select a specific Babel target, but granted, maybe the answer is I just need to use the Babel variable instead of the node variable, but I just wanted to raise that point. I can see that biting people.
Jan?
Yeah, I think that at least from what I know about the ecosystem right now, I think packages deepen the dependency tree, switching behavior based on node env for other environment variables is something that's already pretty widespread, especially like node env test, maybe not quite as much as node env production, but even for node env test, I would not be surprised if there's packages that are decently popular that would change behavior if node env is test. I think my question behind that was, I thought that our implementation already had a flag for setting custom conditionals, but I assume that got removed at some point. Do you remember, Guy?
A flag for setting what, sorry?
A flag for setting custom conditionals.
No, it doesn't at the moment. It's something we could add. We could add it as an extra flag or experimental flag.
So I guess, like, to me, it seems like the React use case is not a common one, and like it's not zero, right? And it's present in particularly big projects like React, and I'm sure, you know, all the other similar frameworks do it. But like, the vast majority of Node apps and like packages, I think, don't pivot resolvers in this way. And like my testing use case, I'm fine continuing to do my little hacks because it's tests, who cares? But like, I just don't see this pattern commonly used for consumers. I feel like like typically I would expect bundling and minification and optimization to be something you leave to the end consumer. And the fact that React does it, I know why they do it, but it also like creates new problems, and but it's not like a common pattern. So I guess it feels weird to me if that's the only use case it's really solving, it feels weird to me to give that kind of a first class position, you know, in the resolver stuff. Whereas if we can solve a more broader class of use cases, including that one, then that sounds like it might be worth it.
Okay, Jan, did you still have your hand up to add to that? Sure. So to try and come to some conclusion on this, is this something that we're open to implementing? Is it something that we think needs more design work? If we had a flag for customizing the resolution, is anyone against that? Is anyone against experimentation here?
Yeah, so like I don't have any objection to doing it under a flag, as long as we don't have an expectation that that's going to be unflagged without a bunch of extra work. And I'm not necessarily thinking design work from a technical standpoint, but I think there's a lot more like rationale work that would need to be done. And ideally like research of like what are all the use cases this can solve, and what are similar use cases that this won't solve that we're intentionally not solving for. Because I think that might be enough to convince me and hopefully other people without any technical changes, but you know, I don't know yet, if that makes sense.
Sure, and maybe this is something that we should develop when there's more of a driving need from users. But it's certainly something that could be experimental and that we could provide now so that people could play around with it and get more feedback into the process. Wesley has a comment saying that he doesn't like the idea of composing these conditions through a JSON object, that it would be better to write code to do this. Does anyone want to discuss that while we're on this point? Salah?
I think running code to do resolutions is a little bit tricky if that code is going to run in a special environment. So if you want to replicate Node's process elsewhere, if you're not running that code in the standard context, in the, you know, like you can do that code in the main thread and it will behave as expected, then porting what you're doing in resolution with code, porting that context and these globals and these ways of you know, having the certain behavior of that code to other environments gets a lot more trickier than if it's declarative format like JSON. So I think this is the one concern I have about writing resolution with code.
Thanks, Salah. Wesley's counter is the JS community. The JS community historically doesn't like declarative formats. Yeah, so it's a difficult one, but it's a good discussion to have, because I think this composition is an important use case. We have today a lot of users using, for example, the module flag, the module field in the package JSON, and it's not clear how that would interact with the browser field, which is one of my first like justifications for wanting some form of composition. It feels like a very necessary feature to me. And specifically this issue that Tobias posted, he's specifically requesting composition because he needs it in Webpack through this interface. So that the clarification was exactly that we are solving the use case through exports that he's asked for. Geoffrey?
I was just thinking that like this more broadly than this specific issue is like, we should maybe reach out to more folks like Tobias and like the other tool maintainers, big tool maintainers, and Babel maintainers, the React folks, etc. And like I wonder if they're going to give us more feedback about the syntax for conditions, like the whole node and require and default thing that we already like went back and forth on a bunch of times. I feel like before we unflag that, we should probably get that in front of a lot of. I feel like it hasn't really gotten very much exposure yet.
Well, so they're both have been following the proposal. Well, I mean, sorry, both Tobias of Webpack and Devin of Parcel have both been following the proposal and are interested in aligning with it. I've been trying to get as much feedback from them as possible. Ideally, I think it would be great if we could get them into these meetings and make sure that their views are being incorporated into the process. I'll try and follow up with that as well. I did invite Tobias to this meeting, but he couldn't make it. Corey?
So I just wanted to mention one concern I have about composition of the exports and being able to write code that would generate it is I think that might encourage situations where you have modules that have a lot of files and they use it to implement extensionless exports. And that could become a problem if you're trying to take the export map and make an import map for the web. I mean, you don't want one module producing hundreds of K.
I mean, that anyone who wants to allow extensionless imports, that's already going to be an issue. I mean, I already have 2 entries for package JSON in my 3 packages that use exports, one with an extension and one without. Like, and the solution to that is convincing export maps to support a more dynamic format, not trying to pretend like the ecosystem isn't going to want that. But that's sort of a problem that we've kicked the can down, I think, to them, since we're not implement support for it until they do.
Yeah, but there's a difference between what you're saying with, your package has a couple of exports versus, like I said, if there's a package with a lot of exports. Lodash would be a good example. If people were to pester the author to, produce export maps that have all the extensions, if we have the ability for that module to, glob the local directory and dump everything into the export map, then that's going to inflate things.
Admittedly, with the Lodash use case, many users only use a few of Lodash's functions. So they could potentially just include the ones in the import map that they're actually using. And then it might not be such a huge problem.
Unless dynamic imports are used.
Sorry?
Dynamic imports could be kind of a problem with that.
Yeah, dynamic imports are also statically analyzable, mostly. But certainly there are cases, yeah. Wesley?
Like, why would dynamic configuration based on an environment variable be any more privileged than dynamic configuration based on other global state, like the file system? And if dynamic configuration in any way is on the table, why would you not just have it be configurable as code? Because that's what people are already familiar with. Like, I'm not in the mood for inventing a DSL in JSON that supports a subset of code to compose things. Like, having having like an extends field in a JSON object is literally as far as I think is even half reasonable. Like, I would rather not supporting an extends field in a JSON object that causes you to go find another file to include. Like, I would much rather just say, require the document and then spread it in yourself. That's much simpler. Like,
it's not simpler for resolver tools though, like the resolve package or enhanced resolve and so on. It's simply
You're
when
right.
they don't have to execute JavaScript, basically.
You're right, because they have to execute JavaScript then. You're correct. But my point is, if you have, like, I don't think attempting to encode every dynamic behavior that you want to support into a static format is the way to go. I think you just have to admit at some point that you want the system to be pluggable and you want to execute JavaScript.
I mean, with loaders, I think you're right that that's somewhat inevitable. But like, I feel like I'd rather force that to be handled with a loader.
The export map is already a static hook into a loader. All right.
Right.
If you
Yeah,
want,
no, exactly. I'm saying is that
any
I
more
prefer.
configuration than an export map already provides. I think it's fair to say that if you want to compose multiple export maps or have the ability to compose conditions, I think it's fair to say that, well, maybe A, we modify the export maps loaders to support a dynamic thing, or B, you have to include a loader yourself that does support that. But I think the two issues are deeply intertwined, because this concept of loaders is just a concept of replacing the default loader, which we're saying already supports export maps, which is a form of like static configuration. So if you want dynamic configuration, you need a loader that supports dynamic configuration, whether that's the built-in one or another one that you use on top of that.
Well,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your analysis. I have a strong preference for that not being the built-in loader. I want the built-in one to be only static.
so the one, and I'm not trying to argue one way or the other, Wes, but the one difference though is that this would need to be like a package level loader, like, because like the exports map is package level, and right now all of our loaders are global, you know, part of like initializing Node.
Another important property of exports is reversibility, that, you know, it's a one-to-one mapping. And if it's a function, the one-to-one reverse mapping is not necessarily obvious by the way that functions are written in code.
I mean, I would think of the dynamic case as less about like a function that generates a map that could be different every time you call it. It's more like a function that you call once and then you use to get the object, like how Babel RCs and ESLint RCs and every other Coda's configuration file format works. It's called once to create the object.
Right, but you want the entire resolution process to be statically analyzable, and even though it's dynamic, the whole point is that we can determine every possible branch and have full analysis of every possible branch, which is the important information that any tool needs to know, because otherwise it's only seeing a snapshot of the world that it happens to have got at the time of that function execution. Yeah.
I mean, a snapshot of the world at the time of a function execution isn't that much different than a snapshot of the world at the time of some file system state, because
No,
you could
no, very much so, because the difference is if you have exports declarative, the whole thing is there. You know it's never going to change. So you can
only if you assume the file system never changes. Which, if we're willing to extend a similar assumption to say, if we assume that this function doesn't change, that you can make the same assumption.
Well, no, because npm packages have an immutability property. npm packages are immutable. You cannot change a package on npm once it's
like I think what he's saying is like, yes, it'll change if you like edit your package.json, or if you edit the source code of the files in the package. But yeah, that's like, of course. The point is that it doesn't change within the lifetime of the runtime. Like, you would be killing the node process and starting it up again. And then within each node process, it's immutable and it doesn't change. I think that's what Guy's trying to say, Wes.
Jan has his hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to say two things. One, I think something that Geoffrey said a second ago, which was the local versus global loader. I think that just convinced me that we shouldn't have a flag that allows adding custom conditions, because if a package needs custom conditions, it's a very bad sign for the ecosystem, because now two different packages could have two different ideas of what a flag means, potentially even conflicting definitions of a certain random string property value. And since it always has to apply globally to the entire loader if it passes a flag to Node, I think it might be a bad idea to have such a flag, which is kind of beside the point of the current discussion, though. I think the point for me of exports, and that is, after all, somewhat connected to what I just said, is that there's a bunch of tools implemented in various languages, from editor plugins over language runtimes or compilers to runtimes like Node or bundlers like Webpack, that all need to somehow converge on the meaning of, without any additional information, what is the resolution of this thing? And for me, the question is, without anybody running additional code for every single one of those to plug into them to provide the resolution that actually works for the ecosystem, what is the minimal set of stuff that exports needs to provide so that we can have an ecosystem that works with those semantics without everybody having to run every single tool with -- local equal loader equals the thing that actually works. And for me, composition of conditionals, being able to say something like, this is the browser version of the modern build, or this is the browser version of the common JS build, like that kind of stuff, simple ands are, for me, as far as we can tell so far, the minimum of what we actually need to express these things in a way that works for the ecosystem. And so for me, that is why I believe that combining conditionals in some shape or form, whether it's via nesting or via a plus sign or whatever the solution is necessary for exports to succeed as the baseline of what the ecosystem can be, what can be relied upon in the ecosystem.
Salah?
Yeah, I think we moved far along, so my point right now wouldn't really work. But thanks, though. Sorry.
Sure. So we're coming up on halfway through the meeting. Do we want to discuss this topic in more detail? Do we want to try and come up with a resolution and then move on to the release and stability discussions? What would be a good resolution to make at this point?
I guess the question is, can it be something that gets built later? Like, say, imagine it's the end of January and conditional exports is exactly as it is now. If we were to unflag this, then could we add this other stuff later on as an enhancement, or would there be any breaking changes?
It seems to me like it would be a backwards compatible feature. So there's nothing wrong with coming back to this one as a separate phase.
Okay, so then follow-up question then, are there any things that we're talking about or considering related to conditional exports that aren't backwards compatible, that are like, oh, we really should figure this out before we unflag, because, you know, once we unflag, we're kind of locked into stuff?
Yeah, so the big three questions on conditional exports that we've discussed a lot, but I think perhaps might still be where uncertainty lies, are is it clear the way the dual mode packages behave to users with this require default distinction? Are we happy with the names of these conditions? Default require a node, and do we want to ship a node condition? I asked these three questions to Tobias when I was discussing exports with him, and his responses were that he very much wants a node condition. He found require a little bit confusing because he wasn't sure if that would apply to AMD or not in Webpack. And he also found the default name seemed verbose, I guess is the word. I don't have his exact wording. He was trying to think of even sweeter sugars, but I'm trying to, I think what's nice about the current proposal is that we have a very well-defined typing of exports, right? So his suggestion was basically just to remove the word entirely and use either dot or actually just have the string. But I'm not sure that can be adapted into our proposal. Yeah, so are we happy with the names? Are we happy with the way dual mode behaves and with users providing require and default? Are there any confusions there in terms of how the priorities apply? And then are we happy with default? Yeah, those seem like the three to me. Are you bike shedding again?
Sorry, couldn't resist. But no real contribution from my side.
Does anyone have any thoughts on those, or
I mean, if no one's gonna raise their hand, I'll have one thought. I've never, something has always struck me as confusing about node require and default. Well, node and default seem perfectly fine to me, but I feel like if it were me, I would have put, like, I would have node take a child object, and then inside that it would take like CommonJS and module or something like that. That's I mean, I feel like you've given good reasons why that doesn't make sense, but I keep coming back to it in my head and we're like, what were the reasons why we shouldn't do it that way? And I feel like I can't be the only one who's gonna think that or something like that. So I don't know. I just feel like we should verify our assumptions with people and, you know, maybe include
it's a really
explanation.
tough design space, and you'll find like most people on seeing it at first glance won't necessarily immediately have a full picture of how the semantics are behaving. And maybe that's okay, because in most scenarios, people are just copying examples or standard usage examples, which is what they should be doing, because there are certain patterns that are sensible and certain patterns that would not be sensible. But yeah, that's the sort of stuff to check. I've gone through so many iterations of this as well, and feel like this is probably the simplest we can get it, but it is a complex design space. Yeah, Salah?
Yeah, so just I have one concern about node being a condition. If we're saying node is like specifying that node was the legacy module format being CommonJS, but there's also trying to explain to people that if you use ESM in node, that is still node, but it's not the node condition. Because if you're using a loader, then it is definitely a node condition as well. I would like to say that if we're saying type module, default could as well be module. If it's confusing here, it's confusing there, and it's confusing in the type in the browser, then it's confusing enough to be the confusing thing everywhere. So calling it module is just fine. I mean, we're not going to be very particular here. But default is a little bit presumptuous that a package.json implies that the default is a JavaScript ECMAScript module file. So default here is a little bit strong. I think the word module here is as confusing as it is everywhere else. So yeah.
Jan?
Just to clarify, because I think I heard something between the lines. Node does not mean require or CommonJS or anything. Like Node really means it is using Node APIs. It does not say anything about the module format. So an ES module with Node specific code would still be falling under the Node condition. At least so the current definitions are require is specifically for the require system, for the CommonJS system. Node is specifically just using Node APIs, as in like the standard APIs, global buffer, all that kind of stuff. And default is meant as it is not using any runtime specific APIs, or at least supposedly it's using standard APIs that are cross runtime. So in that way, default is, I think, reasonable because, well, the Node APIs like a global buffer object are not the default across JavaScript runtimes. But yeah, I think rebranding default as module, I know that I ranted against that a lot when I was talking to Guy, but it's nothing that it's not a hill I would die on. I think using module is also okay and has precedent.
Yeah, we share your pain, honestly. Just to say, because type equals module and the browser still does not rest with me. But hey, we have to start somewhere, I guess, right?
So just to add to that briefly, if we have, if anyone has suggestions of an alternative name to use for default, that name is not set and we can change it to anything that is clearer, and maybe it isn't clear to users. Maybe it's not obvious what it means, like main is obvious, or I could get behind changing it to module. The concern with that is just the confusion that it might mean ES module, whereas default can quite happily point to a common JS module and it'll work fine. So there's all those kind of cross-format things. And then also it's worth remembering that the cross-format stuff is the problem we have now, but it's not necessarily what things are going to look like in future. So we've got to be careful that we're not putting names together that, like JS Next, end up in a situation where they look very dated, looking back on them. Sure. Well, so we've got 20 minutes left. I think it sounds like on the exports flag question, we're happy to defer that to a later phase. And then on the export stuff, these have been good discussions to have because they are the semantics that we need to be absolutely certain about coming up to unflagging dual mode. So the next item on the agenda is I'd like to make it the stabilizing the resolver point, which is kind of building on from this. This is issue 451 on Node.js modules. And the overall thinking is that we've got modules unflagged, and people are going to start to ship all these properties in their package JSONs, and we're reaching the point now where we can't make we're going to start to be in a situation where we can't make breaking changes to these things. So it's going out and it's becoming stabilized very quickly. Exports being used, type module being used, and the semantics being used. Now, we are still hoping to backport to Node 12. And we also want to ship, we previously discussed that by the end of Jan, we would look to shipping a dual mode solution. Jordan's got to leave there. Thanks for joining, Jordan. So we're looking to provide a dual mode solution by the end of Jan. The current proposal for that is based on conditional exports. If there are alternatives, those should be brought forward now. If there are adjustments to exports, those should be brought forward now. And then in terms of the stability aspects, there's this kind of risk that I was kind of thinking about, which is the fact that we've got Node 12 LTS going out. Let me just double check the date. Or does anyone remember?
It was January 7th. We needed to have everything like merged into the 12 staging branch.
So 12 LTS is the 21st of January. And we are currently shipping exports in version 13, Node 13. And if we want to backport exports, which apply to both CommonJS and ES modules to Node 12, it seems like it would be, I don't know, maybe it'll be okay. But the concern was that if people are shipping dual mode packages that are going to have a require path, and that require path is expected to trigger if that's going to become an issue, where there will be a Node 12 version out that doesn't support exports, and then suddenly on an LTS release, it does support exports. And now the resolution is going to change in Node.js 12, say Jan or April. So just thinking about those upgrade paths and trying to make sure that they're not going to be, make sure we're not going to be in a situation where it might jeopardize backporting. So thinking about stabilizing the CommonJS resolver and the conditional exports in the CommonJS resolver. Sorry, that's a terrible summary of it, but maybe if anyone else wants to add to that, that could help. Jan, did you still have your hand up from before, or did you want to discuss this?
I briefly lowered in between. So just trying to sum up the base concern, at least for me, if we want to backport the dual mode, like actual ES modules, including the dual mode, so it's not, because I'm assuming if we have dual mode in 13 and 14, but then backport ES module support and unflag in 12 without dual mode, things will be in utter chaos. At least that would be my gut feeling. So if we want to backport it, the longer we wait, the bigger the impact will be, because the more packages there will be that have exports, and the more users there are that might be broken by unexpected imports from exports using packages breaking. So if we can get it in the general release, where there is still a relatively limited impact, not 3 more months where people can be publishing packages that might break consumers on release of 12 with exports, the sooner we can do it, the better, I assume, in terms of ecosystem impact.
Yeah, and as much as possible, if like, I know Jordan's unfortunately just left, but Jordan was saying that he's been applying these in his packages, and as he's been doing that, he's been hitting cases and then discussing them. And I think that's a really important part of the process now, is for us to use this stuff and think about how it affects your users, and what it would mean for Node 12 not to have exports and then suddenly to get it in April. Or should we make sure that Node 12 gets exports already in January? Or if it ships without conditional exports, do we risk a situation where exports would match the default, whereas dual mode is a required default branch, which means that Node 12, if we ship exports without conditional exports and it just matches default, then the Jan to April release of Node 12 would break dual mode just for those versions of Node, because the CommonJS version would try to load the ES module version because it's the default. So thinking through these kinds of cases and making sure that we're crystal clear on our ideal compat and stability of that resolver. Yeah, Geoffrey.
So yeah, it seems to me like what seems like our status quo option of like taking what's already been unflagged, backporting that on January 7th, whatever the deadline was, and then backporting conditional exports way out in April would cause problems, because people will start shipping packages with conditional exports that'll suddenly behave differently between 12 point whatever in January and 12 point something else in April. So it's sort of like that seems to be the worst of 3 options, where the other 2 options are we can just finish conditional exports and unflag it before January 7th, and then the whole thing gets backported together, or the inverse, we don't backport anything until the April release. So yeah, I mean, I guess, Wes,
Yeah.
how do you feel about that? Like, is there an alternative to conditional exports, like in development? Or I know conditional exports itself needs perhaps more refinement, but like, is there a completely different
Node 12
approach?
doesn't support loading modules without a flag, the only thing you need to backport is exports ignoring unknown fields, right?
I think the idea would be that we would backport the unflagging so that Node 12 could support ESM without needing it
We already
temporarily
established
enable
weeks
flags.
ago that we can't backport the unflagging to Node 12 because it's already like LTS, like every major feature that should have been in LTS has already happened weeks ago.
No, I think they said that we could.
That's not a given.
backport the unflagging.
Yeah.
I mean, if that's the case, Wes, then this is all moot, and we don't have to worry about it. And then it never gets backported, or it gets backported but stays flagged. But I'm operating under the assumption that we can backport the unflagging.
It's like I was under the impression that it was already far too late to backport actual features, only bug fixes.
I think the escape hatch that we have is that there is a module implementation in 12. And so the feature is there. Unflagging would be counted as a minor, potentially. So it is not.
No, but like that's for the ESM resolver. Exports is the common JS resolver, right? That's what we care about here. That's the thing that's not behind any flags. There is no escape hatch with respect to that.
The exports for require is behind a flag. It's currently not live on 12 or on 13 as far as I know.
Oh, in that case, yes.
It's live on 13 except for conditional exports.
Yeah, like so the part that's live on 13 without conditional exports, I was under the impression it was too late to backport to 12 because the cutoff for that was 3 weeks ago.
I don't believe that there is anything that explicitly says that features cannot be backported to the LTS, but maybe someone can clarify that.
I mean,
I think Mikhail was in the chat.
Wes, why don't you just assume for a second that we can backport it? Because if we can't, then this is all irrelevant.
That's why I was asking whether we could. Like, why? Like,
I'll look for the thread. There was a thread where I think it was Targos said that we could do it. I'll try to find it, but that's what I remember reading.
Can I say something?
Yep.
Yes, so it's not just that we can backport it. I want to backport it because it will block, if we don't, it will block other changes that are unrelated to ESM. And the more we backport, the easier it will be to land other changes. And the only thing that we cannot do in LTS is major changes, and well, that's the same as current releases.
I mean, isn't a major modification to the require algorithm to support exports a major change? Like, that's why it's in Node 13. Like,
well, was it labeled Semver major?
Yeah, it was definitely
when it
labeled
landed.
Semver major when it landed.
Well, then we cannot backport it. That's a thing.
Well, with exports, we're in a situation where users have not shipped. They're only just starting to ship exports. So by its nature, it is like a feature that is in this gray area where you can't, it doesn't exist because it hasn't got any usage. So even though theoretically it would be breaking, if there is no usage, it's okay to ship because that is not a breaking change at all. The problem comes once people start shipping packages and using exports, which is what's happening now, and exactly why we need to think about this now, is then it does become breaking. So that's why I'm saying if we miss the Jan 7 LTS release, then we probably can't backport. But if we make the Jan 7 LTS release, then it's enough that it won't be a major change because exports will have no code coverage for a while yet.
I mean, I was under the distinct impression that because we missed the deadline, we were loading this all into Node 13. Like that was exactly why we were doing it there, because it was definitely.
Miles has been quite clear throughout the process that he still intended to backport to 12 and that he was aiming to do that. It's not to say that we definitely can, and this might well be a blocker, but this is why we are discussing it, to try and work this path out. Because as Michael says, if we end up in a situation where we cannot backport, that's going to hold back the entire 12 release line. It also has huge adoption implications. It would be nice if we could backport. I believe we can. I believe we need to get Jan 7.
So the thing that we want to backport is exports for CommonJS, including the recognition of nested symbols, right?
Right. So the semantics of exports as stable.
Specifically, only exports for CommonJS, because Node 12 doesn't have ESM. So
Yes.
No,
there's nothing conditional about it. It is just exports for CommonJS.
The conditional part is supporting, e.g., the resolution of the node condition, the default condition, and the required condition.
I mean, but CommonJS, obviously, Node 12 would only actually.
no, Wes, look at, do you see the screen that I'm sharing?
Not all of it, no.
All right. Well, I also dropped a link in the chat. The discussion was to backport the whole thing we have so far, the unflagging, all features that have currently shipped. And then the discussion is whether we should ship that or wait until we can unflag conditional exports to ship with that. And I think that's what this discussion's about, is like, you know, we had agreed to like hold off until the end of January for conditional exports, but that would mean that we missed the January 7th deadline. So if we could, you know, get our act together and resolve any remaining issues with conditional exports by January 7th, then we could get that merged in, unflagged on 13 before the 7th. Then the whole thing, like everything ESM related that's on 13 on January 7th gets backported to 12.
Also, very quick,
and then
I just checked the implement express proposal pull request. It is marked as Semver minor.
Oh, okay.
And then we could entirely unflag either in January or April. I believe Miles was looking to do an April unflagging of modules entirely on 12, and that might give us a little bit more of a buffer to deal with any further feedback on the implementation of modules in general. Or we could, if we could get our act together, we could get it. Just depends how we feel about that stability. Corey.
Yes, I just wanted to take a second to advocate for all or nothing with regard to unflagging exports in 12. If we can't unflag conditional exports at the same time, then I hope that doesn't hit an LTS. Mainly because of the problem where with the conditional exports, default would refer to ESM, whereas without the conditional exports, the 12 LTS would ignore the require field. And that would create a breaking change where essentially you couldn't produce a package that would work on the 12 LTS and future versions. That's all.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left.
I think it's probably,
yeah.
Sorry, I was gonna say, I think it's probably fair to say I guess we have consensus that we shouldn't backport unflagging without conditionals being resolved one way or another. If that's fair to say. So then the question is whether we think we can get conditional exports done by January 7th, which I know is not what we agreed on a few weeks ago. And that's why I wanted to bring it up like so directly, and that's why I tagged you, Wes, on that thread. So we don't have to discuss it in the 2 minutes we have left, but since there's only, whatever, 2 meetings before January 7th, I think we should try to like make a priority to get this discussed.
And one meeting potentially on New Year's Day. So maybe we need to discuss our
yeah. Or we can have it out of band or something, I don't know, but we should at least discuss this and figure out what we're going to do, if we're going to try to make it or decide that we're going to aim for April or something else.
Does anyone object to us setting this as a target and trying to shoot for it? Not to say that we might not hit issues. Does anyone think that we shouldn't do this?
Shouldn't aim for January 7th, you mean?
Backporting exports for CommonJS with conditional exports for Jan 7 at least.
I mean, I don't think it makes sense to backport exports without all of the modules implementation, considering it's used to feature detect for modules, or at least that's part of it, right? Like that's how you have something that supports both Node.
I think we all agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, the feature detection is the require branch in exports. So you say exports.
That's feature detection for whether or not you are loading a module or a CommonJS library. We're talking about feature detection between whether you're on Node 10 or Node 13 plus, which is whether or not exports is supported at all. Like that's why exports.
Right.
I think the idea would be that if we backport exports at all, it would be the entire implementation that is on 13. We're not going to do some weird hybrid where it gets only some of the features, because that introduces all these other problems. So that's the question, is like, do we think we can finish exports, including conditional exports, by January 7th?
Well, I mean, like, asking whether we think we can isn't particularly helpful. It's if it's done, it'll be done.
Well,
if it's not.
Are you opposed to us like aiming for that?
And similarly, like
try to surface all of your remaining concerns
what
with it so that they
concerns
can be
there would
addressed
be.
quickly, since January 7th is pretty soon.
Right. So for us not to get to the meeting on January 2nd or whenever we manage to make it, and then suddenly objections to try and think through what the blockers to that might be now.
I mean, like, yeah, you're still working on exports right now and resolving the questions with that, which work through it. Like, meanwhile, like, supposedly I still have some time to attempt to put together something, or rather port the change that I already made to the current version of Node so that people actually look at it. Ugh.
I mean, I think that if you're talking about require VSM, I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
They are mutually exclusive because they both change what you do with a package when you get it from require in CommonJS. They are mutually exclusive.
Well, I mean, why don't we shoot for the deadline and then, you know.
As I said, like, talking about like either it's done or it's not by that point in time. Like that talking about aiming for it, it doesn't mean anything.
Right, but it would also be a problem for in terms of the counter proposal should also be able to work to the same deadline. So I don't see we should be delayed because of counter proposal work that hasn't been able to meet the same timeline requirements. And if that is a problem, then for us to know about that now.
I mean, I at least only have time to work on this on like the weekends when I like don't have other things scheduled. And the reason that we said the end of January is because, well, December is like the holidays and like I'm supposed to like go spend time with family and stuff. But, you know, the December 7th being the LTS deadline just moves it up by 3 weeks, I guess.
Yeah, it sucks. I mean, I'm not saying this is ideal. I mean, we can see if there's any flexibility between like a deadline in between January and April, but I have a feeling they're going to say no.
I mean, like, was asking.
Here, I can ask that in the thread.
The major thing that we should concern ourselves with is guaranteeing that we are actually able to backport this to Node 12 and will be allowed to in either case. Like, if we're not, that's like...
We're able to backport.
Like, I like, I already assumed that we would not be able to backport because we were not able to even make the change to the CommonJS resolver that we had to then immediately reflag in Node 12. So.
Yeah, I mean, I did discuss.
Because, like, we can't support type module in Node 12, which is part of the modules implementation, because that breaks people because people already started using it. So we can't backport to Node 12 because of it.
We can make that, if that error is a problem, we can make it a warning instead of an error. That is a good point.
Like, like there's.
Yeah,
I think the point here is just like with type module, there is a non-zero probability that we backported, we ship a new release of Node 12, something about it breaks somebody, and we can do, just like with type module, do a more or less surgical adjustment by patching it. That doesn't have to prevent us from backporting. Like we can address the thing precisely that is actually breaking them.
And specifically with exports, when the change to the resolver is entirely hinged on exports in the package JSON, and we've looked through NPM and seen how many packages have exports, yes, it will break those 10 packages where exports do not have the same semantics. But yeah, out of 1.14 million.
I don't know. We weren't willing to make the breaking change a couple of weeks ago, so I don't see why at the LTS deadline is going to be any better.
Okay. Well, we've reached time for today, so I'm going to call the end of the meeting unless anyone wants to have a final word on this stuff.
Thanks for running the meeting.